Hi everyone. Okay, it's time to start a new series, and I figured to make a change, we could look at some theory as opposed to whole games. I have a copy of the great Jose Raul Capablanca's Chess Fundamentals, and I'd like to go through a few chapters of it. First of all, I'll give you some information about the man himself. If you're at all interested in the history of chess, then you'll certainly know who he is. He was born in Havana, Cuba in 1888 and is widely regarded as one of the greatest chess players of all time. Bobby Fischer in particular had massive respect for his talent. He was renowned especially for his exceptional endgame skill, and at the age of 13 he defeated the Cuban national champion Juan Corzo. 5 years later he went to university in New York because he wanted to join their baseball team, and whilst there he joined the Manhattan Chess Club, and his true talent was quickly realized by all who saw him play. 3 years later he was finished with university and made chess the focus of his life. He was particularly good at rapid chess, and as his fame as a player grew, he did a lot of tours and simultaneous exhibitions. In 1909, for example, he played 602 games in 27 cities, with an overall score of 96.4%, which was far ahead of the players considered the best in the country, and this result earned him sponsorship for an exhibition match against Frank Marshall, who was the US champion later that year, and he smashed Marshall 15-8 with only one loss, and afterwards announced that he'd never opened a book on chess openings. And he went on to win tournament after tournament and was soon world famous. From 1916 to 1924 he didn't lose a single game, and became world champion in 1921 and retained that title until, to the utter amazement of the chess world, he lost it to Alexander Alekhine in 1927. His style was focused on positional elements as opposed to tactics, and interestingly a study was done of all the great world champions using a chess engine, and Capablanca was found to play the most accurately and with the fewest amount of blunders. Mikhail Botvinnik, the great Russian champion, considered Chess Fundamentals to be the greatest chess book ever written, and I hope you enjoy the lessons here too. The book opens showing how to mate with the different pieces, which is all very straightforward, so I thought I'd skip that and go straight to the second part, which focuses on pawn promotion. And many of you, I'm sure, watching will know all of this inside out already, but it does no harm to review our knowledge, and I'll be moving on to his later and much more complicated chapters as the series progresses. So, to get started anyway, the position on the board in front of us is a draw, and in order to win, white would have to have his king in front of his pawn. Specifically, Capablanca states of such positions, the king should be in front of his pawn with at least one intervening square. If the opposing king is directly in front of the pawn, then the game cannot be won. The way for black to proceed here is to keep the king always directly in front of the pawn, and when it cannot be done, as in this position before us because of the white king, which is guarding e3 here, then the black king must be kept in front of the white king. Play might proceed as follows: e3, king e5, king d3, and king d5, which is a very important move. Any other move would lose the game because it lets the white king through, and playing king d5 keeps the opposition between the kings, which is an aspect we'll return to later. Because the black king couldn't be kept close up to the pawn, it has to be brought as far forward as possible, and at the same time kept in front of the white king. Play might continue here: e4 check, king e5, king e3, king e6, king f4, and we have the same situation again. The only move that saves the game now is king f6, which keeps the white king from moving further up the board. The crucial thing to remember is that the black king must stay in front of the white king when it cannot stay in front of the pawn. Playing this way will eventually force a draw by the 50 move rule if white doesn't agree to one before. or force a stalemate. For example, if things carry on here the same way, with e5 check, now comes king e6, king e4, king e7, king d5, king d7, the crucial move again, e6 check, king e7, king e5, king e8, king d6, king d8, and it's completely drawn. If e7 check now, then king e8, and white's only move to keep the king protecting the pawn is to move to e6, but that's stalemate. And if instead of advancing the pawn to e7, white had moved his king back down the board, then black simply places his king in front of the pawn, which would be e7, and keeps the white king from passing with the same technique we saw earlier. After this exercise, Capablanca writes, "The whole mode of procedure is very important, and the student should become thoroughly conversant with its details, for it involves principles to be taken up later on, and because many a beginner has lost identical positions from lack of proper knowledge. At this stage of the book, I cannot lay too much stress on its importance." So, next example. And we need to flip the board here. Yeah, okay. In this position, on the other hand, white wins, as the king is in front of the pawn, and there is one intervening square. The method to follow is to advance the king as far as is compatible with the safety of the pawn, and never to advance the pawn until it's essential to its own safety. The correct move here, then, is king e4, and black plays king e6, trying to stop the white king from passing. So now white advances the pawn, which forces the black king out of the way of the white king because black has to make a move. So, king f6, and now king d5, and king e7. If black had played instead king f5, now the correct move for white is e4 check, because advancing his king instead would allow black to play e4 himself with the king, which would win the pawn. So, king e7, and seeing as black hasn't done that, it's better for white not to advance his pawn yet, because the safety of the pawn doesn't require it, but to try and bring his king further forward. So, king e5, king d7, king f6, king e8, and now it's correct to move the pawn up, because it's too far back, and it needs to be brought into the protection of the king with e4. Now king d7 and e5. Playing instead king f7 doesn't work, because now comes king d6, and white has to bring his king back to defend the pawn. So it's correct to push it instead with e5. And now king e8, because if black had moved anywhere else, white could have played king f7 from where it can shepherd the pawn in, because it defends these three squares that the pawn has to pass over in order to become a queen. But black has prevented that, so now white must force the king away, while at the same time keeping his king in front of the pawn. So the correct move is king e6. If he'd got careless thinking he was winning whatever he did and played instead e6, now black can force a draw with king f8. And the position is identical to the one we were looking at in the last example. So king e6, now king f8, is one of only two moves. Now king d7, and white shepherds the pawn home because he's covering these three squares, and the pawn becomes a queen, and it's an easy mate. If black had played instead at this stage king d8, then king f7, and it's the same story. The king is covering these three squares. So those are the first lessons from Capablanca. Like I said, it's simple to begin with, but it will get much more complicated and intricate later on as the series progresses. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.